sun sets over Willow Creek, the ground remembers, and what lies beneath the soil doesn't always stay buried. Welcome to Night Creepypasta Rules, where every shadow holds a story, and every story holds a warning. Tonight's tale? I work the graveyard night shift. We have 3 strange rules to survive. And believe me, they're not just rules. They're conditions for staying alive. Stay till the end. There's a twist buried in this one. Deep and still breathing. Deep and still breathing. Comment below. Would you walk into a fog that only covers one grave? And if you hear crying from an empty plot, would you stop? Subscribe if you know some doors shouldn't be opened. Especially the ones that lock from the inside. Especially the ones that lock from the inside. And now, let's walk into the dark together. Most people lock their doors against the darkness. Me? I lock myself inside it 5 nights a week. The massive, wrought iron gates of Willow Creek Cemetery groaned, shut behind me. The heavy clank of the padlock echoing unnervingly in the vast, deepening twilight. Another shift began. Honestly, the job wasn't bad. Surprisingly good pay for walking around in the quiet dark, checking fences, making sure no teenagers were trying to spook themselves or vandalize history. And mostly, it was quiet. A profound, heavy silence layered over the distant hum of the city, broken only by the sigh of wind through the ancient, drooping willows that gave the cemetery its name, or the occasional mournful cry of an owl. Peaceful, even if you ignored the rules. Willow Creek was beautiful, in a melancholy, time-worn way. Rolling hills dotted with angels, weathered smooth by forgotten rains. Obelisks listing slightly like tired sentinels. Mausoleums clinging to hillsides like stone barnacles. Moonlight silvered the marble, cast long dancing shadows from the gnarled oaks and maples. The air smelled damp, earthy, of decaying leaves and late-blooming jasmine clinging to the stone walls near the entrance, a sweet perfume overlaying the inevitable scent of cold earth. It was easy sometimes to forget where you were, to just appreciate the stillness, until you remembered the rules old Abner Cole, the senior groundskeeper, had drilled into me during my first week. Rules delivered with the weary gravity of a man reciting scripture he desperately wished wasn't true. I'd just taken over from Abner as dusk settled, the sky bruising purple and orange. He was finishing his usual end-of-day ritual, tending the small, meticulously kept plot near the oldest willow tree, where his wife, Martha, rested. He didn't just place flowers. He spoke to her quietly, straightened the small stone marker, pulled weeds with a focused tenderness that felt deeply personal, almost devotional. He looked up as I approached, his face deeply lined, eyes the color of faded denim under bushy gray brows. "Evening, Rowan," he grunted, wiping dirt from his calloused hands onto his worn overalls. "Quiet day. Cooler tonight, wind's picking up." He gathered his tools. That Professor fella, Holloway, was poking around again, down by the hemlock section. "Left this for you." Abner handed me a crisp white business card. Dr. Julian Holloway, Historical Archives and Thanatological Studies. Below the name, a handwritten note. M's Gray. If you observe any unusual bioluminescent fungi or significant atmospheric anomalies during your patrols, particularly after midnight, I would be most grateful for a detailed account. Call anytime. Bioluminescent fungi. I raised an eyebrow. Abner snorted, a dry, humorless sound. Academics got rocks in their heads instead of sense. Just ignore him mostly. More importantly, his tone shifted, becoming low and serious. "You remember the rules?" "Yes, Abner." Loud and clear. Just then, headlights swept across the iron gates as a familiar beat-up pickup truck pulled over outside. Marcus Jones, my oldest friend from this town, leaned out the window, offering a grin and a large thermos. "Night shift survival kit," he called out, passing the steaming thermos through the bars before I locked them. "Hot chocolate, extra marshmallows. You sure about this gig, Ro? Someone's gotta do it, Mark." I smiled. the warmth of the thermos seeping into my hands. And the dead don't complain about my music choices, he chuckled. But his eyes held genuine concern as they scanned the deepening shadows behind me. Yeah, well, just be careful, okay? My grandma always swore this ground wasn't quite right after dark. Said things grow here differently. He shuddered slightly. Call me if you need anything. Anything at all. He drove off, leaving me alone with the dead, the dying light, and the weight of Abner's rules settling back onto my shoulders. Locking the heavy gates felt like sealing myself inside a vault. I started my first patrol, flashlight beam cutting its way through the darkness. The familiar path wound through the newer sections first, neat rows of granite headstones, small plastic flags fluttering beside veteran markers. Peaceful enough. But as I moved towards the older sections, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, the silence deeper. Trees pressed closer, their branches like skeletal fingers against the fading sky. I passed a cluster of small, heartbreakingly weathered stones in the children's section, and felt a sudden localized drop in temperature, sharp enough to make me gasp. Gone as quickly as it came. Later, near grand crumbling mausoleum choked with ivy. The ground beneath my boots felt oddly spongy, yielding slightly, like walking on moss covering something soft and unstable. And the smells beneath the damp earth and decaying leaves. Sometimes a strange, sickly sweet odor would drift on the breeze, like overripe fruit mixed with damp soil, vanishing before I could pinpoint its source. These were the subtle things, the easily dismissed quirks Marcus might joke about, but they were the preamble to the rules Abner had laid down with such unnerving seriousness. He'd sat me down in his small, cluttered office in the maintenance shed, the air thick with the smell of soil and old grief, and looked me straight in the eye. This ain't just a job, Rowan, he'd said, his voice low. This place, it holds things, memories, sorrows. You gotta respect it. And you gotta follow the rules if you want to walk out of here same as you walked in. Rule 1. He began, tapping a gnarled finger on the worn desk. Sometimes, mostly in the old section near the unmarked plots, you'll hear crying. Sounds like a baby, maybe a woman weeping something awful. But you check, and there's nobody there. Just an empty grave, maybe a sunken spot in the ground. When you hear that, you keep walking. Don't stop. Don't listen too closely. Don't call out. You ignore it. Completely. Rule 2. He stared hard at me. Fog. Sometimes it rolls in off the hills, normal enough. But if you see a patch of fog, real thick, sitting only over one specific section of the grounds while everywhere else is clear, you don't go in it. Especially not alone. Take the long way around. Wait it out. Never walk into that patchy fog by yourself. And rule 3. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. The main gate, after you lock it for the night. Sometimes later on, if the night feels heavy, you might find it locked behind you when you try to leave on your rounds or head back to the office. Don't panic. Don't rattle it. Don't try the lock. It won't open. It won't open, not until the sun is fully up. You wait inside the gate until sunrise. Then, and only then, it'll open for you. Don't try to force it before. It made me repeat them back, his weary eyes searching mine for understanding, for belief. I'd promised, mostly to placate him then, convinced it was the rambling of an old man, steeped in loneliness and local superstition. Now patrolling deeper into the oldest section, where headstones tilted at crazy angles, worn smooth and nameless by time and weather. His warnings felt less like rambling and more like vital field notes. My flashlight beam swept across the base of a crumbling marble angel, its face eroded into a blank, sorrowful mask. And there, nestled amongst the damp moss and fallen leaves, was a cluster of small pale mushrooms I hadn't noticed before. As my light hit them, they seemed to pulse for a fraction of a second with a faint, sickly greenish bioluminescence. I froze, holding the beam steady, Nothing. Just ordinary-looking fungi, pale and damp in the flashlight's glare. I moved the light away, waited a beat, then swept it back quickly. Still nothing. Just mushrooms. Must have been a trick of the light, moisture reflecting oddly. Just the house. Just the cemetery settling. Probably. My nightly patrols became a strange dance between mundane routine and hypervigilant dread. I learned the paths by heart, the names on the more prominent stones, the way moonlight caught the wings of a marble angel just so. I got used to the profound silence, the scuttling of unseen nocturnal animals, the sigh of wind through the omnipresent willows. I tried to rationalize the spongy patches of ground, the fleeting cold spots, the faint, sickly sweet smell that sometimes drifted near the older sections, decomposition, natural temperature shifts, the nearby woods. But Abner Cole's rules echoed with every step I took. The first rule manifested itself on a damp, moonless night, deep within the oldest section of Willow Creek, where headstones crumbled and ivy choked the markers of forgotten names. I heard it before I saw the area. A soft, heartbreaking sound drifting through the stillness. Weeping. It sounded like a very young child, sobbing with a desolate, inconsolable grief that twisted something deep inside my chest. My flashlight beam swept towards the sound, landing on a sunken patch of earth between two leaning, illegible stones. An unmarked, seemingly empty grave. The crying emanated directly from that spot, clear as a bell, raw with suffering. Every instinct screamed to approach, to offer comfort, to see who was there. It felt wrong to ignore such profound sorrow. But Rule 1, Abner's grim voice echoing in my memory, held me fast. Hear crying from an empty grave. Ignore it. My heart hammered against my ribs. Was this a trick? An echo? Or something truly lost needing help? I forced my gaze away, turned my back on the heartbreaking sound, and continued my patrol, boots crunching too loudly on the gravel path. The weeping seemed to intensify for a moment, pulling at me, then slowly faded behind me into the oppressive silence. I didn't look back, but the sound haunted me for the rest of the night. The next day, as Abner was packing up his tools, I asked him carefully, trying to sound casual. "Abner, ever hear strange noises out in the old section at night? Sounded almost like crying last night?" He stopped, his back to me, busying himself with cleaning a trowel. He didn't turn around when he spoke, his voice rougher than usual. "Ground holds sorrows here, Rowan. Always has. Especially that old Potter's Field section." He finally turned, his eyes avoiding mine. "Some grief runs too deep, seeps into the soil itself. Best not to dwell on it. Like feeding weeds. You listen too close, you give it strength. Ignore it, it quiets down. Mostly." His metaphorical warning felt chillingly literal. Later, seeking a more rational perspective, I called the number on the business card Dr. Julian Holloway had left. He answered immediately, his voice smooth, academically curious. I described the crying incident, carefully framing it as an unexplained auditory phenomenon near the unmarked burial area. His interest was immediate, intense, fascinating, absolutely fascinating. He enthused. "Could you pinpoint the exact location on the cemetery map I provided Abner? What was the quality of the sound? High-pitched, intermittent? Any discernible words or purely emotional vocalization? How long did it last? Did you notice any corresponding environmental changes?" He suggested possibilities. Wind through specific rock formations, subterranean water acoustics. But his questions felt less like scientific inquiry and more like targeted data gathering. He urged me to document any recurrence with precise time and location details for his ongoing environmental study of Willow Creek. A few nights later, my patrol route took me past that same sunken patch of ground again. There was no crime tonight, but lying directly in the center of the depression, stark against the dark earth in my flashlight beam, was a single, perfect white rose. Its petals were fresh, dewy, impossibly vibrant, despite the lack of any recent burials or visitors nearby. It hadn't been there before. I stared at it, a cold dread creeping up my spine. Something had heard my passing, and it had left a calling card. The rose vanished by the next night, leaving only the unsettling memory. I found myself becoming hyper-aware of the cemetery's subtle shifts. Patches of bizarrely shaped, faintly phosphorescent fungi would appear overnight on old tree stumps, only to wither and vanish by dawn. The sickly sweet smell of decay seemed stronger near certain mausoleums, particular ones Dr. Holloway had expressed interest in during our phone call. The ground in the oldest sections continued to feel strangely yielding underfoot, spongy, almost alive. Then came the fog. It wasn't the usual rolling mist that sometimes crept up from the valley after midnight. This was different. One moment, the cemetery lay clear under a sharp, starry sky. The next, a thick, impenetrable bank of white fog had materialized, covering only one specific area, the section near the back fence bordering the woods, an area containing mostly infant graves from the late 19th century, shaded by a massive ancient weeping willow. The fog bank was unnaturally dense, opaque, swirling slowly within its defined borders, while the air outside remained perfectly clear, and it carried that faint, sickly sweet smell, stronger now. My patrol route required me to pass along the edge of that section. Rule 2. Fog covers only one section. Never enter it alone. I stopped well short of the fog bank's edge. Curiosity warred with a primal sense of caution. The fog looked wrong. Felt wrong. It seemed to pulse faintly, and I could almost swear I heard indistinct murmurs, like whispered secrets, drifting from within its swirling depths. A strange dizziness touched me even from this distance. A slight disorientation, as if the air itself was different near the fog. Remembering the rule, I made a wide detour, skirting the edge of the woods, adding a good 15 minutes to my patrol. It meant leaving that section physically unchecked for a while, a breach of my duties. But Abner's warning and the palpable wrongness of the fog felt more pressing. As I watched from a safe distance on higher ground, flashlight off, I saw it. The lantern visitor, the figure I'd glimpsed on my first night, emerged from the trees near the edge of the fog bank, carrying its dim, old-fashioned lantern. It walked slowly, deliberately, into the swirling white mist. I waited, holding my breath, expecting to see it emerge from the other side. Minutes passed. The figure did not reappear. The fog remained thick and silent. Eventually, hours later, as the first hint of dawn touched the sky, the fog dissipated rapidly, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only damp grass glistening under the emerging light. There was no sign of the lantern visitor. When I mentioned the localized fog to Abner later that morning, he just nodded grimly, wiping grease from his hands. "Aye, the willow weep, my wife used to call it," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. "Comes and goes, bad air in there, confuses the head. You did right staying out of it alone." He offered no more explanation, turning back pointedly to the lawnmower engine he was tinkering with. I contacted Dr. Holloway, relaying my observation of the fog, its location near the infant graves and the willow, its strange smell, and even mentioning the lantern visitor disappearing into it. His academic excitement was almost palpable through the phone line. Extraordinary, localized atmospheric condensation, potentially linked to high concentrations of decaying organic matter and specific fungal spore releases. Did you feel any psychoactive effects yourself, Miss Grey? Dizziness? Auditory phenomena? He brushed off the lantern visitor as likely a trick of the light or my own stress. Then came the request. "I have a small, state-of-the-art atmospheric sensor," he said smoothly. designed to analyze particulate matter and airborne biologicals. If this fog appears again, would you be willing to place it just inside the edge? For purely scientific data collection, of course. I can leave it with Abner for you. A sensor. Or was it a stimulus device? His eagerness felt predatory. I gave a non-committal answer, the suspicion solidifying in my gut. That night, small, pale, oddly shaped mushrooms pushed up through the grass at the edge of where the fog bank had been. They glowed faintly for an hour, then crumbled to dust before midnight. The feeling of being a pawn in someone else's game grew stronger. Dr. Holloway's calls became more frequent, filled with leading questions disguised as academic curiosity, always steering the conversation towards phenomena near specific, historically significant grave sites or areas with unusual flora. Simultaneously, the cemetery itself felt more active. Doors on unattended mausoleums would creak open. Fresh flowers left on graves would wilt overnight. And the ground felt increasingly alive beneath my feet, subtly shifting, breathing. Abner became quieter, more withdrawn, his warnings fewer, but his eyes holding a deeper fear. My breaking point came one cold, clear night just before dawn. I completed my final patrol, the cemetery wrapped in pre-dawn stillness. The only sound my own footsteps on the gravel path heading back towards the main gate. I reached the massive, ornate iron gates, pulled out the heavy key Abner had entrusted to me, inserted it into the antique lock, turned. Nothing. The lock wouldn't budge. I tried again, jiggling the key, pushing against the immense weight of the gate, solidly locked from the inside. But I was the only one with the key inside the grounds. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. Rule of 3. If the gate locks behind you, don't try to open it until sunrise. I was trapped. My first instinct was raw fear. I rattled the gate violently, pointlessly shouting Abner's name into the empty darkness beyond the cemetery walls. The heavy iron remained impassive, immovable, defeated. Remembering the rule, the futility, I sank onto the cold stone steps just inside the gate, wrapping my arms around myself, watching the eastern horizon, waiting for the sun, feeling utterly exposed and vulnerable. The silence of the cemetery pressed in, no longer peaceful, but predatory. Hours seemed to pass. Finally, the first hesitant rays of sunlight pierced the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pale rose and gold. Exactly as the fiery edge of the sun cleared the distant tree line, illuminating the dew-kissed headstones, I heard it. A loud, definitive clank echoed from the gate's locking mechanism. I scrambled up, heart pounding, inserted the key again. This time the lock turned smoothly. The heavy iron gate swung inward with a low groan. Freedom. Shaken and exhausted, I found Abner already starting his morning rounds near the entrance, pruning shears in hand. I stammered out what happened, the gate locking me in. He listened patiently, his expression grim but unsurprised. Aye, he nodded slowly, not looking up from his work. Happens sometimes. When the ground gets restless during the night, gate holds things in, holds things back, until the sun clears the air. Good you waited, Rowan. Good you didn't try to force it. Makes the ground real angry near the posts when you do that. His calm acceptance was almost more terrifying than the event itself. Later that morning, needing to process, I called Dr. Holloway. I reported the gate incident, framing it as a mechanical failure, possibly due to temperature change. His response was telling. He offered cursory sympathy about the inconvenience, then immediately pivoted. Most interesting. And before you found the gate locked, Miss Grey, did you happen to notice any other phenomena during your final patrol? Any unusual temperature drops near the Thorne family mausoleum, perhaps? Auditory events near the Potter's Field section? Did you happen to deploy that sensor I left for you near the Willow Weep area? His questions were laser-focused, transparently trying to correlate the gate lock the cemetery's large-scale reaction, with activity in his specific areas of interest. He wasn't just observing, he was poking the bear, and I was the stick. My anger solidified into cold resolve as I walked out through the now open gate, starting my walk home just as the first round's crew arrived. My fingers brushed against the intricate iron scrollwork near the latch. Tucked almost invisibly within the design was a small, flat object. I pulled it out. It was a smooth, cool piece of intricately carved whalebone, scrimshaw, maybe 19th century, depicting a tangled, root-like pattern. Near it hadn't been there yesterday. Where had it come from? Left for me? By whom? Or what? The questions multiplied, unsettling as the silence of Willow Creek at midnight. The scrimshaw piece felt alien in my pocket, smooth and cool. A relic washed up from a sea of history I didn't understand. But Dr. Holloway's pointed questions after the gate incident, his laser focus on correlating my experiences with his specific areas of interest, dispelled any lingering doubts about coincidence. He wasn't just passively researching Willow Creek's past. He was actively poking its present, and I had become his unwitting instrument. Fueled by a cold anger that pushed back the fear, I spent my off hours online, not researching local ghost stories, but Dr. Julian Holloway himself. His published papers were dense, academic, focused on mycology, ethnobotany, and neurolinguistics, but delving into obscure university archives and fringe scientific forums revealed a more obsessive undercurrent. Grant proposals often rejected, hypothesizing about subterranean mycelial networks acting as vast biological memory banks, papers acting as vast biological memory banks, theorizing on psychotropic spore dispersal as a form of primitive communication in fungal colonies, even speculative work on bioresonant frequencies influencing ambient emotional states. Willow Creek Cemetery, with its unique soil composition, ancient trees, and documented history of mass hysteria and unexplained phenomena, which he subtly referenced in footnotes, appeared frequently as a site of potential significance. Then I found the abstract for a privately funded unpublished study, inducing and documenting psychoacoustic responses in complex subterranean mycelial networks. A case study at Willow Creek. The methodology section was heavily redacted, but keywords remained: low-frequency sonic emitters, localized nutrient aerosolization, human proximity as variable catalyst. The sensor he gave me, it all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. He wasn't studying the cemetery's ghosts. He was studying the ancient, perhaps sentient, fungal network beneath it. The bloom, as I started calling it in my head, and he was using me, my nightly patrols, my presence, as a trigger, a variable in his unethical experiment. I needed to confront him, but on my terms, perhaps on its terms. I called him later that day, injecting feigned excitement into my voice. Dr. Holloway, Rowan Grey, you were right to be interested in that spot near the old Potter's Field, where I heard the crying. I deliberately chose the location of the Rule 1 trigger. Well, you have to see it. New fungal growth appeared overnight. It's phosphorescent, pulsing faintly. It's incredible. His eagerness was almost unprofessional. Truly remarkable. Described the luminescence, the morphology. He readily agreed to meet me inside the cemetery, just after my shift started at dusk, promising to bring his specialized recording equipment. Twilight painted the sky in bruised purples and oranges as Holloway arrived, carrying a heavy, professional-looking equipment case, practically vibrating with academic anticipation. He followed me eagerly towards the old section, towards the fictitious light show I described. We stopped at the sunken, unmarked grave area. The air here was always colder, smelling faintly of damp earth and that sickly, sweet decay. Well, Holloway asked, scanning the ground expectantly with a sophisticated light meter. Where is this bioluminescence? There isn't any, Doctor, I said quietly, turning to face him, letting my flashlight beam illuminate the sensor I held in my hand. Just like there isn't really a sensor here, is there? More like a low-frequency sonic emitter with a time nutrient spray, calibrated to stimulate my celial activity. Holloway froze, the light meter slipping slightly in his grip. His face, caught between the dying light and my flashlight beam, went pale. Ms. Grey, I assure you, standard environmental monitoring equipment. Save it. I cut him off, my voice tight with anger. I read your research proposals, the redacted ones too. I know what you're doing. Willow Creek isn't just old dirt and sad stories to you, is it? It's your giant petri dish. The crying I heard, the fog patch, maybe even the gate locking. How much of that was spontaneous? And how much was your experiment reacting to my presence after you activated an area? I held up the sensor. This thing practically hums when I get near certain spots you asked about. He tried to regain composure, puffing himself up with academic indignation. My research is legitimate scientific inquiry into unique environmental phenomena, documenting natural cycles. By using me as bait? By deliberately provoking something you barely understand, something Abner Cole warned you about. My voice rose. He knows this place isn't just soil and fungus, doesn't he? He knows it's dangerous. Holloway's academic mask finally crumbled, revealing the raw obsession beneath. His eyes glittered with a fanatic's light. Dangerous. It's magnificent, he hissed, his voice dropping to a fervent whisper. An organism potentially predating the cemetery itself, spanning acres, communicating through means we can only guess at. It holds memory, influences emotion. Those rules are just peasant superstitions trying to rationalize complex biological responses. Think of the knowledge it holds, the potential. He gestured wildly. Yes, your presence acted as a novel stimulus, triggering clearer responses than my probes alone. The data is groundbreaking. He seemed genuinely baffled by my fear, my anger. The risks are minimal, calculated, compared to the potential breakthrough. Minimal? I stared at him aghast. Tell that to the lantern visitor. Anecdotal, he snapped, then seemed to realize I'd gone too far. He opened his heavy equipment case. Inside wasn't just recording gear, but a larger device bristling with wires, antennae, and glass vials filled with viscous liquids. This, he said, his voice regaining its zealous fervor, will allow for direct bioresonant frequency communication. We can finally move beyond simple stimulus response. We can attempt dialogue. Before I could protest, before I could even process the sheer insanity, he flicked a switch on the device. It emitted a low, powerful hum that sunk into the ground, vibrating up through the soles of my boots, making my teeth ache. For a heart-stopping moment, absolute silence descended on the cemetery. Even the wind died. Then the ground beneath our feet trembled. The sickly, sweet smell of decay intensified tenfold, thick and cloying. From the sunken earth of the crying grave beside us, a low moan began, quickly joined by others from nearby plots. A rising chorus of synthesized grief. Pale ghostly fungi erupted from the soil all around. Not small patches now, but thick carpets, pulsing with an angry greenish-white light that illuminated the scene in strobing, nauseating waves. The ground felt like sponge, yielding, breathing. And then it came. From the earth itself, tearing through the grass and roots near the base of the crumbling angel statue. Thick, ropey, pale tendrils burst upwards. Mycelial cables, glistening wetly, writhed like eyeless serpents, reaching, questing. More erupted nearby, forming pulsating columns, rustling, seeming almost to listen. Simultaneously, a dense swirling fog, thick as cotton batting and carrying the same sweet metallic scent, began pouring from the ground around the disturbed graves, rolling towards us. the whispers within it no longer indistinct but coalescing into overlapping voices crying, pleading, accusing. Remarkable. Holloway breathed, adjusting dials on his device, utterly captivated. Interspecific bioacoustic resonance achieved. He didn't seem to notice the fungal tendrils whipping closer, the psychotropic fog swirling around our ankles, making the world tilt, the chorus of despairing voices clawing at my sanity. The rules screamed uselessly in my mind. Ignore the crying? The crying was everywhere. Avoid the fog. We were in it. The bloom? The ancient consciousness beneath Willow Creek was awake, enraged, and expanding rapidly from the earth, summoned by the historian's fatal ambition, trapping us both at the heart of its terrifying, uncontrolled bloom. The world dissolved into a nightmare of pulsing green light, writhing pale tendrils, and the deafening chorus of synthesized grief. The sickly sweet smell of decay and ozone choked the air. My flashlight beam barely penetrated the swirling spore fog, erupting from the ground around Dr. Holloway's humming device. He was laughing, a high-pitched, ecstatic sound, scribbling frantically in a waterproof notebook, even as mycelial strands began twining around his ankles. Sentience! He shrieked over the din. Bioresonant communication. Panic, cold and sharp, spurred me to action. This wasn't research, it was suicide, and he was trying to take me with him. Remembering Abner's mutterings about iron, I gripped my heavy metal flashlight like a club. I lunged, not at Holloway, but at his complex device, bringing the flashlight down hard on its control panel. Sparks flew. The low hum intensified into a high-pitched whine, then cut out abruptly. The effect was instantaneous. The intense pulsing light faded, the chorus of crying faltered, and the erupting fungal growth slowed, though the tendrils already above ground continued to writhe sluggishly. But the fog, thick with spores, still swirled, and Holloway screamed in fury as his connection was severed. "You fool! You've ruined years of work." He glared at me, his eyes wild, no longer the detached academic but a thwarted obsessive. Before he could lunge, or before the tendrils decided we were still interesting, another light cut through the fog, the harsh, steady beam of an old railroad lantern. Abner Cole emerged from the mist, wielding a rusty iron spade like a broadsword. His face was grim, set in hard lines. "This way, Rowan. Now!" he bellowed, his voice cutting through the residual whispers. He swung the iron spade in a wide arc, severing grasping mycelial strands near our feet. They recoiled as if burned. Iron slows it. Light bothers it. Move. I cast one last look at Holloway, who was now trying to repair his damaged device, oblivious as the spore fog thickened around him, and pale tendrils began tentatively reaching for him again. He was lost to his obsession. I turned and scrambled after Abner, coughing as the sweet, cloying fog burned my lungs. Abner canoed paths I hadn't seen, winding between leaning headstones, avoiding the areas where the ground felt too spongy or the air too cold. He used the lantern beam and the iron spade defensively, keeping the slower-moving tendrils and the worst of the fog at bay. Finally, he shoved open the door to a small stone groundskeeper's shed, tucked away near the cemetery's back wall, pulling me inside and slamming the heavy wooden door shut, barring it with the iron spade. We collapsed onto dusty burlap sacks inside, gasping for breath, the sounds of the aroused bloom, rustling, sighing, whispering, audible even through the stone walls. "Told you," Abner panted, wiping sweat and grime from his face. "Told you not to listen to academics filling your head with nonsense." He finally told me more then, his voice low and filled with old pain. About his wife, Martha, how she loved gardening near the willow weep section, how she started changing, fatigue, confusion, then seeing things, hearing whispers, A cough that never left. How the doctors found nothing until it was too late, lungs scarred as if by some unknown fungus. He found Holloway's early research papers after her death, recognized the descriptions, the location. He knew it was the bloom, the ancient thing in the soil that took her. He'd spent the decades since then observing it, learning its rhythms, its dislikes. Iron, salt, direct sunlight, fire, developing the rules not to control it, but to simply avoid waking it, avoiding provoking its more dangerous manifestations. Like the spore fog. Holloway. Abner spat the name like poison. He knew the risks, read my wife's case file, but saw only opportunity, been poking it, stimulating it for months. Your arrival, new energy, must have been what he was waiting for. A distant, horrifying scream cut through the night outside, abruptly silenced. Holloway. We looked at each other, the unspoken truth hanging heavy in the small shed. Then came the low groan. Not from the earth this time, but from the main cemetery gate far across the grounds. A heavy, metallic clank echoed faintly. Gate sealed, Abner said unnecessarily. His face grim in the lantern light. Bloom's fully awake now, stirred up proper. We're locked in till sunrise. He checked his watch. 3 more hours. Longest 3 hours of your life. He rummaged in an old crate, pulling out rock salt. More iron tools. It won't like us being here. Might try the door. He looked around the small shed. But maybe Holloway's recklessness left something useful. Scattered near where we'd entered. Dropped perhaps during Holloway's earlier visits, were some of his research notes. Pages torn from a binder. We gathered them, scanning them by lantern light. Complex diagrams, frequency charts, chemical analyses, and one page detailing the blooms. Observed heightened sensitivity to sudden, intense ultraviolet light, causing temporary paralysis or retraction of surface mycelia. A desperate chance. The next 3 hours were a masterclass in claustrophobic terror. The shed door rattled intermittently, heavy scraping sounds dragging against the stone outside. Pallid probing fungal tendrils snaked under the doorframe, recoiling only when Abner sprinkled rock salt directly onto them. The air grew thick with the sweet, cloying scent of decay, and faint whispers seemed to seep through the very walls. We sat in silence mostly, back to back, Abner clutching his iron spade, me holding the heavy flashlight with the UV bulb setting Holloway's notes had mentioned. If the flimsy shed door gave way, waiting for dawn felt like waiting for an execution. But slowly, agonizingly, the quality of the darkness outside began to change. The whispers subsided, the scraping sounds ceased. A pale gray light began to filter through the shed's single grimy window pane. Almost time. Abner breathed, getting stiffly to his feet. It recedes with the direct sun, weakens the surface growth, but the ground will still be active. We gotta move fast, stick to the paved paths mostly. We unbarred the door cautiously. The immediate area around the shed looked clearer. The thickest fungal growth seemed to have pulled back slightly, leaving slimy trails on the grass. But the air still felt heavy, charged, and the sickly sweet smell lingered. We began the long walk back towards the main gate, Abner leading the way. Testing the ground, me watching our backs, flashlight held ready despite the growing daylight. We saw patches where the bloom had erupted. Grayish-white mycelium coating headstones like shrouds. Strange, puffball-like fungi clinging to tree trunks. We heard faint, residual crying near the potter's field. Ignored it. Skirted a low-lying area where a thin, iridescent mist still clung to the ground. Finally, the main gates came into view. Sunlight now streamed over the eastern hills, bathing the front sections of the cemetery in warm light. We reached the massive iron gates. The lock mechanism looked normal again, no mycelium visible. Abner inserted his key. With a groan of protesting metal, the lock turned. He pushed the heavy gate open. Freedom. We stumbled out onto the dew-wet grass beyond the cemetery walls just as Marcus Jones' pickup truck came barreling down the road, skidding to a halt beside us. He must have been waiting, worried sick. Rowan, Abner, my God, are you okay? He yelled, jumping out. The explanation given to the authorities later was a heavily edited mess. Vandals, maybe Holloway, reported now as a missing person who had been trespassing. Causing damage, accidental lock-in. Plausible enough, apparently. The cemetery was closed for repairs and assessment. Abner, looking exhausted but resolute, retired shortly after, leaving Willow Creek to find its own balance, or perhaps find a new caretaker eventually. I helped him settle into a small cabin further down the mountain. Visited often. Dr. Holloway was never found. I couldn't stay in Asheville. The mountains felt watchful. The damp earth felt alive in a way that chilled me to the bone. I moved away, seeking concrete and steel, dry air, distance. Months later, living in a coastal city, I thought I was putting it behind me, until a damp morning after a heavy rain. Walking through a small city park, I noticed it. A patch of unusually vibrant shelf fungus growing on the bark of an old oak tree near the path. Nothing strange, just nature. But on impulse, I reached out, my fingers brushing against its cool, velvety surface. For just an instant, I felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible thrum beneath the bark. A distant, familiar resonance, like the echo of a vast, sleeping consciousness deep underground. I snatched my hand back, my heart pounding. Later that day, looking out my apartment window, I saw the condensation on the cool glass, and traced within it, intricate, almost invisible, were delicate, branching, mycelium-like patterns of frost. I had escaped Willow Creek, but the spores of that ancient, aware organism, the memory of its touch, the sensitivity it awakened in me, that, I suspected, would be with me forever. A part of the bloom, however small, had taken root. The rules were simple, but she broke one by listening. He broke another by experimenting. And the last broke itself. The bloom is awake now, and it remembers the ones who disturbed its rest. If this story chilled you, drop a comment below. Which rule would you break? Or would you follow them all and still not make it out? Tell us what you do when the gate locks and the soil starts to breathe. And subscribe to Night Creepypasta Rules, where the dead don't sleep and the stories never stop growing. We'll see you again. Just watch the ground beneath your feet.